Picture this. A 27-year-old inventory specialist named Blix Weatherton is sitting in his remarkably unremarkable cubicle on Lunar Station, cataloguing rubber ducks for the Galactic Novelty Import Division, when his computer screen suddenly flashes bright purple and begins playing what sounds like a funeral march composed entirely of dial-up modem sounds. This is generally considered a bad sign in any technological context, but particularly when you work for a government agency whose idea of cutting-edge technology is a calculator that only occasionally catches fire. The screen displays a message that reads, "Congratulations, you have been randomly selected for mandatory voluntary participation in the Galactic Rehabilitation and Character Development Program. Please report to Transportation Hub 7 immediately for your complimentary one-way journey to personal growth and almost certain doom." Blix stares at this message for approximately 47 seconds. Which is roughly how long it takes for his brain to process that the universe has just played what might be the most expensive practical joke in recorded history on him specifically. "Excuse me," he shouts to his supervisor, a purple blob named Quendarian Schlubsworth, who communicates primarily through interpretive dance and aggressive sighing. "I think my computer just volunteered me for something I definitely didn't volunteer for." Quendarian performs what appears to be a complex routine, expressing either "that's unfortunate but administratively binding" or "I need to use the bathroom urgently." Given that Quendarian has been performing the same dance for every workplace crisis over the past 3 years, Blix has learned to assume it means both. "But I can't leave," Blix protests. "I'm in the middle of cataloguing 17,000 rubber ducks. Do you know how long it takes to properly classify rubber ducks by species authenticity when half of them are modeled after creatures that don't actually exist?" Quendarian responds with a particularly vigorous hip thrust that clearly indicates, "Your concerns have been noted and filed under not my problem." That's when the Transportation Division arrives. They enter Blix's cubicle like a tactical team whose primary training involved watching too many action movies and whose secondary training involved absolutely nothing useful whatsoever. There are 6 of them, all wearing matching uniforms that somehow manage to look both completely professional and utterly ridiculous simultaneously. The lead officer, whose name tag reads Captain Mundane Catastrophe, approaches Blix with the confident stride of someone who has never questioned a single order in his entire life. "Blix Weatherton?" Captain Catastrophe asks, consulting a clipboard that appears to have been assembled from spare parts of other, more successful clipboards. "That depends," Blix says carefully. "Are you here to arrest me, promote me, or sacrifice me to something with too many teeth?" "Option C," Captain Catastrophe announces cheerfully. "You've been selected for relocation to Grimfang Prime, a Class 15 Deathworld, where you'll be given the opportunity to demonstrate humanity's legendary resilience in the face of absolutely hopeless circumstances." Blix blinks. "I'm sorry, what now?" "It's very exciting," continues Captain Catastrophe, apparently unaware that his news is not being received with the enthusiasm he'd expected. "You'll be representing your entire species in a time-honored tradition of sending individuals to places where survival is statistically impossible but theoretically achievable through sheer bloody-minded determination. I didn't volunteer for this." "Oh, you don't volunteer for the Galactic Rehabilitation and Character Development Program." Captain Catastrophe laughs as if Blix has just suggested something hilariously naive, like expecting government software to work properly. "The program volunteers you. It's completely different." "How is that different?" "Well, for starters, volunteering implies choice. And choice implies the possibility of saying no, and saying no implies that we care about your opinion." Captain Catastrophe's smile could have powered a small solar system. "This way is much more efficient, and that's how Blix Weatherton inventory specialist and part-time philosopher of rubber duck authenticity, found himself being escorted through Lunar Station's corridors by 6 Transportation Division officers who seemed to think they were doing him an enormous favor by shipping him off to die on a planet specifically designed to kill things. The transport bay was exactly what you'd expect from a government facility, with a budget smaller than most people's coffee allowances, functional in the way that a broken elevator is technically still an elevator, just not one you'd want to trust with your life. The ship assigned to take Blix to Grimfang Prime was called the Inevitable Disappointment, which he felt was either refreshingly honest or deeply concerning, depending on your perspective. "Lovely ship," declared Captain Catastrophe as they approached what appeared to be a cargo container with delusions of grandeur. "She's got artificial gravity that works almost 60% of the time, life support systems that have only failed twice this century, and navigation equipment that's been certified probably accurate by the Department of Close Enough." "This is supposed to get me to another planet?" Blix asked, eyeing a section of hull that seemed to be held together with what looked suspiciously like duct tape and wishful thinking. "Oh, absolutely. The Inevitable Disappointment has a perfect safety record." "Really?" "Yes. She's never failed to deliver her cargo to the intended destination." "What about the passengers?" Captain Catastrophe paused. "Well, that's a separate statistic entirely. The pilot turned out to be a creature that looked like someone had asked an octopus to cosplay as a retired circus performer and then given up halfway through. His name was Kringle Tentaclesmythe, and he seemed to view space travel as a form of extreme sport that he wasn't particularly good at, but enjoyed anyway. "Welcome aboard," Kringle bellowed as Blix was strapped into what might charitably be called a seat, and uncharitably be called a collection of metal parts arranged in the rough shape of furniture. "I'm your pilot for this journey into the terrifying unknown. I've been flying for 37 years and have only crashed into things that weren't supposed to be crashed into on 14 separate occasions." "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" Blix asked. "Well, it's better than 15. Kringle began flipping switches with the random enthusiasm of someone playing a particularly complex game of chance. "Now, I should mention that the journey to Grimfang Prime takes approximately 47 hours, during which time you'll have the opportunity to contemplate your life choices, read some excellent literature about survival techniques, and possibly experience what we in the business call temporary existential dread." "Temporary?" "Oh, yes. It stops being temporary once you land." The launch was what Blix would later describe as like being fired out of a cannon by someone who had never seen a cannon before, but had heard them described by a person who was afraid of loud noises. The Inevitable Disappointment lurched, shuddered, made a sound like a dying whale attempting to sing opera, and then somehow managed to achieve what could technically be called flight. "Excellent!" Kringle shouted over the sound of various mechanical components expressing their dissatisfaction with current circumstances. "We're airborne. Well, technically we're spaceborne. Well, technically we're somewhere between airborne and spaceborne in a way that defies several laws of physics but appears to be working anyway." Blix spent the first few hours of the journey reading the survival manual he'd been provided, which was titled, "So You're Going to Die on a Deathworld, a Practical Guide to Impractical Situations." Chapter 1 was called Accepting the Inevitable While Maintaining a Positive Attitude. Chapter 2, The 17 Most Common Ways to Die on Grimfang Prime and Why You Should Avoid Them. Chapter 3, How to Write a Meaningful Last Message When You Only Have 17 Seconds to Live. "This is encouraging," Blix muttered, flipping to Chapter 4. Advanced Techniques for Screaming, Effectively in Low-Oxygen Environments. "Oh, you're reading the manual," Kringle called from the pilot's seat, where he appeared to be playing some kind of complex game involving flashing lights and increasingly frantic beeping sounds. "Excellent choice. Very thorough, that manual. I helped write Chapter 12, Why Flying Vehicles Don't Work on Grimfang Prime and What to Do When Yours Inevitably Crashes." "That's oddly specific." Yes, I've crash-landed on Grimfang Prime 6 times. Wonderful place for emergency landings. Absolutely terrible place for everything else. Blix continued reading. Chapter 5. Identifying edible plants. Hint, there aren't any. Chapter 6. Identifying safe water sources. Hint, there aren't any of those either. Chapter 7. The psychology of accepting that everything on this planet wants to kill you, including the rocks. Question, Blix called out. The manual keeps mentioning that the rocks want to kill me. That's a metaphor, right? Oh, no, Kringle laughed with the cheerful enthusiasm of someone discussing the weather. The rocks on Grimfang Prime are absolutely trying to kill you. Carnivorous sediment, fascinating stuff. They've evolved the ability to sense body heat and launch themselves at prey with remarkable accuracy. The rocks are carnivorous. Indeed, and the trees, and the water, and the air, in certain atmospheric conditions. Really, it's quite impressive how thoroughly the entire planet has dedicated itself to the elimination of foreign life forms. Blix went back to reading. Chapter 8. Why traditional shelter construction techniques don't work when your building materials are actively trying to eat you. Chapter 9. The art of making peace with your impending doom. Din. Chapter 10. How to negotiate with hostile terrain. Spoiler alert, you can't. The journey continued for what felt like several geological ages, but was probably closer to the advertised 47 hours. Blix had time to read the entire survival manual twice, learn 17 different techniques for efficient panicking, and discover that the ship's entertainment system consisted entirely of a collection of audio recordings titled Soothing Sounds of Administrative Efficiency, which was just 8 hours of filing cabinet drawers being opened and closed in a rhythmic pattern. Approaching Grimfang Prime, Kringle announced as various warning lights began flashing in colors that didn't exist in any natural spectrum. Prepare for what I like to call atmospheric entry, which is like regular atmospheric entry, except everything goes wrong all at once. Through the viewport, Blix could see Grimfang Prime approaching. It looked exactly like what you'd expect a planet to look like if it had been designed by a committee of demons with anger management issues and a particular grudge against the concept of life itself. The continents were shaped like angry faces. The oceans were the color of regret mixed with disappointment. The clouds formed patterns that seemed to spell out "go away" in every language simultaneously. Beautiful, isn't it? Kringle said fondly. I've always loved planets that are completely honest about their intentions. The landing was what could charitably be described as a controlled descent into chaos, and what could uncharitably be described as the kind of crash that makes other crashes feel inadequate. The inevitable disappointment lived up to her name by successfully delivering Blix to Grimfang Prime's surface through a series of impacts that somehow managed to be both catastrophic and oddly rhythmic. Blix crawled out of the wreckage, somehow miraculously alive despite all evidence suggesting this should have been impossible. He stood up, brushed off the various fluids that had leaked from the ship's multiple ruptured systems, and surveyed his new home. The first thing he noticed was that everything was trying to kill him. This was not a metaphor or an exaggeration. Everything was trying to kill him. The grass was reaching toward his feet with tiny, grasping motions. The trees were actively leaning in his direction with branches that ended in what were unmistakably sharp points. Even the pebbles on the ground seemed to be arranging themselves into more aerodynamically efficient killing configurations. Well, Blix said to nobody in particular, this is exactly as horrible as advertised. That's when he heard the singing. It wasn't good singing. It wasn't even singing that suggested the singer understood what singing was supposed to sound like. It was the kind of singing that made you question whether the universe had made a fundamental error in allowing sound to exist. But it was definitely singing, and it was coming from somewhere nearby. Blix followed the sound through a landscape that seemed to have been designed by someone who had taken the concept of hostile environment and treated it as a personal challenge. He passed trees that tried to grab him, rocks that rolled in his direction with obvious malicious intent, and flowers that tracked his movement with expressions of barely contained homicidal rage. The singing was getting louder, and somehow even worse. It sounded like someone was trying to perform opera while being digested by a very musical stomach. Blix crested a small hill and saw the source of the noise. It was a creature that looked like someone had tried to build a dragon out of spare parts from a demolition derby and then given up halfway through. It was approximately the size of a small building, covered in scales that seemed to change color based on its mood, and it had approximately 17 different types of teeth, all of them designed for different methods of enthusiastic violence. The creature was sitting in what appeared to be a crater, surrounded by the remains of various spacecraft, singing what might have been a ballad, if ballads were supposed to make listeners question their life choices. "Oh, the loneliness of being a planetary guardian," the creature sang in a voice that sounded like gravel being processed through a blender. "Nobody ever visits, nobody ever stays. They all just crash and die immediately." Blix watched this display for several minutes, trying to process what he was seeing. The creature appeared to be sad, lonely, possibly experiencing an existential crisis while sitting in a pile of crashed spaceships. "Excuse me," Blix called out. The creature stopped singing and turned to look at him with eyes the size of dinner plates. "Oh," it exclaimed. "A visitor, how wonderful. I'm Gorblax the Terrible, guardian of this sector of Grimfang Prime. Are you here to try to kill me?" "Not particularly," Blix replied. "I'm Blix. I was sent here by accident." "By accident?" Gorblax looked confused, which was an impressive achievement for a creature whose face was primarily designed for intimidation. But all surface dwellers come here to challenge me in mortal combat. It's tradition." "What kind of tradition?" "The kind where brave warriors arrive from the stars to test their strength against the mighty guardian of Grimfang Prime." Gorblax gestured proudly at the pile of crashed ships. "I've been defeated in glorious battle exactly 0 times." Blix looked at the wreckage surrounding Gorblax. "It looks like you've had a lot of challenges." "Oh yes, hundreds, thousands. They arrive, we engage in ritual combat. I win, they die. I compose an epic ballad commemorating their brave sacrifice." Gorblax's expression grew wistful. "The problem is, they all die so quickly. I barely get to know them before the fighting starts." "How quickly?" "Well, the longest fight lasted almost 30 seconds. Most of them die when they hit the ground. It's very anticlimactic." Blix stared at him. "You mean you've been sitting here for years, waiting for someone to actually survive landing so you could have a proper conversation before the ritual combat?" "Exactly!" Gorblax's entire demeanor brightened, which was somewhat terrifying given that his version of bright involved several types of bioluminescence. "You're the first person to actually talk to me. Usually they just scream and die. It's very disappointing." "I can imagine." "Would you like some tea before we fight to the death?" Gorblax asked hopefully. "I've been practicing my hospitality skills." Blix considered this offer. On one hand, accepting tea from a giant carnivorous dragon thing on a planet specifically designed to kill him seemed like exactly the kind of decision that would feature prominently in his obituary. On the other hand, the alternative was immediately engaging in mortal combat with a creature that had apparently never lost a fight, and at least tea would give him time to think of a better plan. "Tea sounds lovely," he said. Gorblax's joy was so intense, it caused several nearby rocks to stop trying to kill things and just stand there in awe. "Wonderful! Nobody has ever accepted my tea invitation. This is the best day ever." The next few hours were among the strangest of Blix's life, and this was a man who had once spent a week cataloguing rubber ducks that had achieved sentience through a filing error in the Department of Artificial Life Creation. Gorblax, it turned out, was not only a terrifying guardian monster, but also an accomplished host who had spent decades perfecting his tea-making skills in anticipation of someday having a guest who lived long enough to appreciate them. "I grow the tea myself," Gorblax explained as he served Blix a cup that was roughly the size of a small bathtub. "It's a special blend of 17 different plants that are only mildly poisonous to most life forms. I've been experimenting with different combinations for the past 40 years. The tea was actually quite good, once Blix got past the fact that it was glowing slightly and seemed to be moving on its own. "This is delicious. What's the glowing effect?" "Oh, that's just the bioluminescent algae I add for flavor. Don't worry, it only causes hallucinations in about 30% of non-native species." "That's reassuring. I do try to be a good host. It's been terribly lonely here, you know. The only company I get is the occasional ship full of warriors coming to challenge me, and they're always so focused on the fighting that they never want to just chat." Blix sipped his tea and looked around Gorblax's crater. Now that he was closer, he could see that it wasn't just a random collection of crashed ships. Gorblax had carefully arranged them into what appeared to be a kind of monument, with small plaques commemorating each fallen challenger. "You remember all of them?" Blix asked. "Of course, every single one." Gorblax pointed to various sections of his memorial. "There's Krex the Mighty, who lasted 15 seconds, and Vorthak the Unstoppable, who lasted 8, and poor little Squeaker McGillicuddy, who didn't even make it out of his landing pod before a carnivorous boulder got him. That's actually kind of touching. I try to honor their memory. Each one represents someone who was brave enough to come here and challenge the unknown. Even if they died immediately and anticlimactically." Blix was beginning to understand something that the survival manual hadn't covered. "Gorblax, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you actually want to fight all these people to the death?" Gorblax paused in the middle of pouring himself more tea. "Or what do you mean? I mean, do you enjoy the fighting, or do you do it because it's expected?" Gorblax looked confused. "I do it because I'm the Guardian. It's my job. Warriors come to challenge me, and I defend my territory. That's how it works. But what if it didn't work that way?" "I don't understand." Blix set down his teacup and looked at Gorblax seriously. "What if instead of fighting visitors to the death, you just talked to them? Showed them around? Maybe helped them survive on this planet instead of killing them immediately?" Gorblax stared at him for a long moment. You mean I could have friends instead of just a series of extremely brief mortal enemies?" "Exactly. But that's not how guardianship works, is it? Who says?" Gorblax looked around at his memorial to fallen challengers. "I suppose nobody ever actually told me I had to kill everyone. I just assumed that's what guardians do. Maybe it's time to try a different approach." You mean you're not here to fight me?" "I'm here because of a bureaucratic error," Blix explained. "I'm supposed to either die horribly or somehow survive long enough to be rescued. Fighting you to the death doesn't really accomplish either goal efficiently." "So what do you want to do?" Blix looked around at the landscape of Grimfang Prime with its carnivorous rocks and homicidal vegetation and generally hostile attitude toward the concept of life. Then he looked at Gorblax, who, despite being a terrifying dragon thing, was clearly just lonely and had been misunderstanding his job description for decades. "I want to figure out how to survive on this planet," Blix said, "and I think you could help me." "Me? Help you survive?" Gorblax looked astonished. "But I'm supposed to be the thing you survive from." "Says who?" Says... Gorblax paused. "Actually, now that I think about it, nobody ever specifically said that. I just assumed. Maybe it's time to try something new." And that's how Blix Weatherton, inventory specialist and accidental philosopher of survival, became the first person in recorded history to negotiate a career change with a planetary guardian monster. The next few weeks were a revelation for both of them. Gorblax, it turned out, knew Grimfang Prime better than anyone or anything else in the galaxy. He'd been living there for centuries, learning every detail of the planet's geography, biology, and psychology. He knew which plants were merely toxic versus completely lethal, which rocks were actively carnivorous versus just generally unfriendly, and which areas of the planet were merely incredibly dangerous versus absolutely certain death. The key to surviving here, Gorblax explained as they walked through a forest where the trees were actively trying to impale them, is understanding that everything on this planet operates on a very simple principle. If it's not trying to kill you right now, it's probably planning to kill you later. That's reassuring. Oh, but that's the beautiful part. Once you accept that everything is hostile, you can start working with the hostility instead of against it. Blix ducked as a branch swung at his head. How do you work with something trying to kill you? Well, for example, these trees, Gorblax gestured at the murderous forest around them. They attack anything that moves, right? But they attack in predictable patterns, so if you know the patterns, you can use them to your advantage. How? Watch this. Gorblax picked up a rock and threw it at a particularly aggressive-looking tree. The tree immediately swung all its branches toward the rock, creating a clear path underneath. See? The trees are so focused on attacking movement that they'll ignore you if you move when they're distracted. That's actually brilliant. Thank you. I've had a lot of time to study them. Now let me show you how to identify which rocks are just regular rocks versus rocks that are waiting for you to get close enough to bite. Over the following days, Gorblax taught Blix everything he'd learned about surviving on Grimfang Prime. How to recognize the difference between water that would merely make you sick versus water that would dissolve you from the inside out. How to build shelter using materials that were only mildly toxic instead of completely lethal. How to navigate by the stars when the stars themselves were trying to give you misleading directions. The thing about this planet, Gorblax explained as they sat by a fire made from wood that only occasionally tried to escape, is that it's not actually evil. It's just very, very committed to being inhospitable. What's the difference? Evil would be personal. This is just business. The planet isn't trying to kill you because it hates you specifically. It's trying to kill you because that's what it does to everyone. It's very egalitarian. Blix had to admit this was oddly comforting. So it's not personal. Not at all. The planet would try to kill its own mother if she visited. It's nothing to take personally. As the weeks passed, Blix found himself actually adapting to life on Grimfang Prime. He learned to sleep in trees that were only moderately carnivorous, to drink water that was merely toxic instead of immediately lethal, and to walk with the peculiar gait required to avoid triggering the planet's various motion-activated death traps. More importantly, he and Gorblax became friends, real friends. The kind of friends who could sit around a campfire made of mildly explosive wood and discuss philosophy while carnivorous insects tried to eat them. "I've been thinking," Blix said one evening, as they watched a sunset that was beautiful despite being composed entirely of toxic gases, "about your job as a guardian." "What about it?" "Well, you've been guarding this planet for centuries, right?" "Yes." "And in all that time, has anyone ever actually threatened it?" Gorblax considered this. "Well, there were all those warriors who came to challenge me. But they didn't come to conquer the planet or hurt it, did they? They just came to fight you personally." That's true. So really, you've been protecting yourself, not the planet." "I suppose I have. But what if there was a better way to protect things?" Gorblax looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Blix gestured at the landscape around them. "This planet is incredible, Gorblax. It's terrifying and hostile and absolutely committed to killing everything that lands on it, but it's also unique. There's nothing else like it in the galaxy. So maybe instead of killing everyone who comes here, you could teach them to appreciate it, show them how to survive here, like you showed me. Turn visitors into, I don't know, students instead of casualties." Gorblax was quiet for a long moment. You mean I could be a teacher instead of a killer?" "Why not? But who would want to learn how to survive on a planet that's actively trying to murder them?" Blix thought about this. In his experience with government bureaucracy, he'd learned that there were always people who were willing to do incredibly difficult and pointless things if you presented them correctly. Adventurers, researchers, people who want to prove they can survive anywhere. Hell, there are probably academics who would pay to come here and study the unique ecosystem. You really think so? I know so. The galaxy is full of people looking for challenges. The trick is making sure they survive long enough to enjoy them. That night, as Blix lay in his shelter made of minimally toxic plants, he thought about his situation. 3 months ago, he'd been a nobody cataloguing rubber ducks in a government office. Now he was living on the most dangerous planet in known space, having philosophical discussions with a dragon thing about career alternatives, and actually enjoying himself. It was, he realized, probably the first time in his adult life that he'd felt like he was doing something that actually mattered. The next morning, Gorblax approached him with an expression that somehow managed to convey both excitement and terror, which was quite an achievement for a face designed primarily for intimidation. "I've been thinking about what you said," Gorblax announced, "about being a teacher instead of a killer, and I want to try it, but I'm going to need help." "What kind of help?" "Well, if I'm going to start teaching people instead of killing them, I'm going to need students. And if I'm going to have students, I'm going to need a way to get them here safely. And if I'm going to get them here safely, I'm going to need to figure out how to make this planet slightly less immediately lethal." Blix considered this. "Those are all good points. Do you have any ideas?" "Actually, yes. What if we started small? What if we just tried to save the next person who gets sent here?" "You think someone else is coming?" "Oh, absolutely. They send people here all the time. Usually about 1 per month. In fact," Gorblax paused and tilted his head, listening to something Blix couldn't hear. "I think someone's arriving right now." Sure enough, in the distance, Blix could see the familiar sight of a government transport ship approaching Grimfang Prime's atmosphere with all the grace and competence typical of government operations, which is to say it was already on fire and making sounds that suggested its pilot was either very brave or very confused about basic aviation principles. "Quick," Gorblax said. "We need to get to the usual crash site before they land." They ran through the hostile landscape, dodging carnivorous plants and homicidal geology, until they reached the clearing where most ships traditionally crashed. The transport was coming in fast, leaving a trail of smoke and what appeared to be small explosions in its wake. "This is going to be a bad one," Gorblax observed, as the ship performed what could charitably be called an uncontrolled descent, and what could uncharitably be called a gravity-assisted disassembly sequence. The ship hit the ground with the kind of impact that makes seismologists on neighboring planets sit up and take notice. For several minutes there was nothing but smoke, debris, and the sound of various mechanical systems expressing their displeasure with recent events. Then from the wreckage they heard a voice. "Well, that was absolutely terrible!" A figure emerged from the smoke, coughing and covered in what appeared to be rainbow-colored lubricant from the ship's failed systems. It was a tall, thin creature with purple skin, 4 arms, and an expression that suggested it was simultaneously angry, confused, and oddly impressed by the thoroughness of the crash. "Are you quite finished?" the creature shouted at the smoking wreckage. "Because I have several strongly worded complaints about your performance as a means of transportation." Blix and Gorblax exchanged glances. "This one's different," Gorblax whispered. "How can you tell?" "Well, for starters, they're still alive, and they're complaining instead of screaming in terror." The creature turned and noticed them. "Oh, hello! I'm Flemington Zigglebottom, Assistant Deputy Undersecretary for Interdimensional Complaint Processing. I've been sent here to investigate reports of excessive lethality in government relocation procedures. Are either of you responsible for the completely unacceptable survival rate on this planet?" Blix looked at Gorblax. Gorblax looked at Blix. This, Blix said, is either going to be very good or very bad. I vote for very good, Gorblax said hopefully. I like him already. He's got spirit. And that's how Blix Weatherton, inventory specialist turned survival philosopher, and Gorblax, the terrible, reformed planetary guardian, met Flemington Zigglebottom, government inspector, and the galaxy's most persistent bureaucratic pain in the neck. What happened next would change not only their lives, but the entire galactic approach to Class 15 Deathworld management forever. Flemington Zigglebottom turned out to be exactly the kind of person who could survive on Grimfang Prime through sheer bloody-minded determination to file the appropriate paperwork. When a carnivorous rock tried to eat him, he pulled out a complaint form and began documenting the incident in triplicate. When a tree attempted to impale him, he cited 17 different safety regulations that the tree was violating. When the very air tried to poison him, he held his breath and continued taking notes. "This is completely unacceptable," he declared as they walked toward Gorblax's crater, dodging hostile vegetation and geological formations with homicidal tendencies. "The safety standards on this planet are appalling. Where are the warning signs? Where are the protective barriers? Where is the basic infrastructure required to ensure minimal visitor safety?" "It's a death world," Blix pointed out. "I think being deadly is kind of the point." "Nonsense!" Flemington pulled out what appeared to be a handbook, roughly the size of a small building. According to Galactic Safety Regulation 47392, 8b, any location designated for sentient being, relocation must provide adequate facilities for basic survival, reasonable protection from environmental hazards, and access to emergency services in case of catastrophic misfortune. This planet violates at least 17,000 different safety codes. "You want to file a complaint against an entire planet?" Gorblax asked, fascinated. "I want to file several complaints. This is the most comprehensively dangerous place I've ever seen. It's magnificent from a regulatory violation standpoint." Over the next several hours, as they sat around Gorblax's crater drinking tea and listening to Flemington catalogue the planet's numerous safety violations, Blix began to realize that they'd found the missing piece of their plan. "Flemington," he said during a brief pause in the litany of regulatory infractions, "what happens when you file these complaints?" "Oh, standard procedure, investigation, remediation recommendations, implementation of corrective measures, and ongoing compliance monitoring." "And what would corrective measures look like for a Class 15 death world?" Flemington consulted his handbook. "Well, according to Section 892, 4L, locations found to be in violation of basic safety standards must implement appropriate protective measures, including but not limited to warning systems, safety equipment distribution, trained emergency response personnel, and comprehensive visitor orientation programs." Blix and Gorblax looked at each other. "Visitor orientation programs?" Gorblax asked hopefully. "Oh yes, mandatory for any location that receives regular visitors. The programs must include safety training, environmental hazard identification, emergency procedures, and cultural orientation." "Cultural orientation? Absolutely. Visitors must be educated about local customs, social structures, and appropriate interaction protocols with indigenous populations." "You mean," Blix said slowly, "if we filed the right complaints, the government would be required to set up an educational program here?" "Not just any educational program." Flemington's excitement was building. "A comprehensive educational program with trained instructors and safety equipment and emergency support systems. And," he paused, consulting his handbook again, "mandatory funding for all required infrastructure improvements." "Funding?" Blix asked. "Oh yes, the Department of Remedial Compliance is required to provide full financial support for any corrective measures. It's in the regulations. They can't just tell you to fix things, they have to pay for the fixes." Gorblax was practically vibrating with excitement. You mean the government would pay us to turn this place into a school? They wouldn't just pay you." Flemington was now flipping through pages with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered their life's purpose. They'd be required to provide ongoing operational support, instructor salaries, equipment maintenance, emergency medical facilities, transportation infrastructure. It's all in the regulations. Blix felt a strange sensation that he eventually recognized as hope, mixed with the kind of bureaucratic excitement that comes from finding the perfect loophole in an impossibly complex system. What would we need to do? Simple. We file a comprehensive safety violation report, request immediate remediation, and propose specific corrective measures that happen to align with our educational objectives. Flemington pulled out what appeared to be 17 different forms. "I can have the paperwork ready by tomorrow." And they'd actually approve it? They'd have to, once a safety violation is officially documented. The Department of Remedial Compliance has exactly 93 standard galactic days to implement corrective measures or face disciplinary action from the Department of Disciplinary Action. What happens if they don't comply? Oh, then the Department of Disciplinary Action files a complaint with the Department of Complaint Processing, which triggers an investigation by the Department of Investigative Oversight, which reports to the Committee for Oversight of Oversight, which... Flemington paused. Actually, it gets quite complicated after that. But the important thing is that nobody wants to deal with the paperwork involved in not complying, so they just approve everything. And that's how three unlikely friends sitting in a crater on the most dangerous planet in known space accidentally discovered how to game the galactic bureaucratic system. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of forms, applications, safety assessments, and regulatory compliance documentation. Flemington threw himself into the project with the zealous enthusiasm of someone who had finally found a way to use his encyclopedic knowledge of bureaucratic procedure for something genuinely beneficial. Gorblax contributed his centuries of planetary expertise, helping to identify every possible safety violation and environmental hazard. Blix found himself coordinating the entire operation, translating between Flemington's bureaucratic expertise and Gorblax's practical knowledge. "According to my calculations," Flemington announced one morning as he reviewed a stack of forms roughly the height of a small mountain, "Grimfang Prime is currently in violation of approximately 47,832 different safety regulations." "Is that good or bad?" Gorblax asked. "It's magnificent. I've never seen such a comprehensive collection of regulatory violations in one location. The government will have to spend years bringing this place up to code. And that means... It means we're going to get the most well-funded educational facility in galactic history." The response from the Department of Remedial Compliance came exactly 92 days later, delivered by a transport ship that managed to crash land with slightly less catastrophic damage than usual, possibly because it was carrying too much paperwork to achieve proper catastrophic velocity. The official response was contained in a document that was longer than most novels and printed on paper that somehow managed to be both fire-resistant and explosion-proof, suggesting that the Department of Remedial Compliance had learned from experience about the dangers of delivering bad news to volatile locations. "Congratulations," the document began. "Your safety violation report has been processed, approved, and flagged for immediate remediation. The Department of Remedial Compliance is pleased to authorize the following corrective measures." What followed was a list that took Blix 3 hours to read completely and included everything from comprehensive visitor safety training facilities to emergency medical response capabilities to cultural education and interspecies communication programs to ongoing research initiatives into environmental hazard mitigation. The funding authorization was written in numbers so large that Blix had to count the zeros twice to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. "They're giving us how much money?" he asked. Approximately enough to purchase a small moon, Flemington replied cheerfully. Possibly a medium-sized moon if we're careful with the budget. And they're just giving this to us? Oh, they're not giving it to us. They're giving it to the newly established Grimfang Prime Educational and Safety Institute, which, according to the paperwork I filed, is a fully accredited governmental educational facility dedicated to teaching advanced survival techniques and interspecies cultural exchange. We have an institute now? We have an institute now, complete with official government recognition, tax-exempt status, and a mandate to accept students from across the galaxy. Gorblax was staring at the paperwork with an expression of pure wonder. You mean I'm going to be an official teacher? Not just any teacher. Flemington consulted another form. According to your personnel file, you're now Professor Gorblax the Terrible, Senior Instructor of Environmental Hazard Studies and Cultural Heritage Preservation. You even get a salary. I get paid to teach people how to survive on my planet? You get paid very well to teach people how to survive on your planet. The government considers advanced survival education to be a high-priority skill development initiative. And that's how Gorblax the Terrible, former Lonely Planetary Guardian, became Professor Gorblax the Terrible, senior faculty member of the galaxy's first government-funded Deathworld Survival Academy. The construction phase was exactly as chaotic as you'd expect when you're trying to build an educational facility on a planet that's actively trying to kill the construction workers. The Department of Remedial Compliance sent teams of engineers, architects, and safety specialists, along with enough protective equipment to outfit a small army. "This is fascinating," declared Chief Engineer Blortonox Quillbottom as he watched a team of construction workers trying to install safety barriers around a particularly aggressive grove of carnivorous trees. "I've never seen building materials actively resist construction before. The concrete keeps trying to escape." "That's because we're using locally sourced materials," Gorblax explained. "Everything on this planet has some level of hostility. But once you understand the hostility patterns, you can work with them instead of against them." "How do you work with hostile concrete?" "Well, the concrete doesn't actually want to hurt anyone. It just wants to move around. So we let it move, but we give it specific places to go." Gorblax gestured to a section of the construction site where the concrete had been allowed to flow into decorative patterns that somehow managed to be both beautiful and strategically defensive. "See, now it's happy, and we have walls that are both functional and self-defending." The engineers were fascinated. Within weeks, they'd developed an entirely new construction philosophy based on cooperative hostility management, which involved working with the planet's aggressive tendencies rather than fighting them. The results were structures that were not only incredibly durable, but also aesthetically striking in a way that suggested they'd been designed by someone with a very sophisticated understanding of controlled chaos. The first students arrived 6 months later. They came from across the galaxy, adventure seekers, survival specialists, researchers, and what Flemington diplomatically referred to as individuals seeking character development through controlled exposure to mortal peril. The initial class included a nervous academic from the core worlds who wanted to study extreme ecosystem adaptation, a grizzled military instructor who thought his troops needed more challenging training environments, and a tourist from the pleasure planets who had apparently gotten bored with conventional vacation destinations. "Welcome!" Gorblax announced to the assembled group as they stood in the newly constructed orientation amphitheater, which had been built into a natural crater and decorated with examples of the planet's more photogenic attempts at murder. "I'm Professor Gorblax the Terrible, and I'll be your primary instructor in advanced environmental hostility survival." The students looked appropriately terrified, which Gorblax considered a good start. "Now, the first thing you need to understand about Grimfang Prime," he continued, "is that everything here wants to kill you. The plants want to kill you. The rocks want to kill you. The water wants to kill you. The AIR wants to kill you under certain atmospheric conditions. But here's the secret. He paused dramatically. They want to kill you in predictable ways. Blix, who was serving as Assistant Director of Student Services, watched from the back of the amphitheater as Gorblax launched into his first official lecture. It was exactly what he'd hoped it would be: informative, engaging, and just terrifying enough to keep the students' attention without actually putting them in immediate danger. The key to survival, Gorblax was explaining, is understanding that this planet operates on logical principles. Deadly logical principles, but logical nonetheless. Everything here follows rules. Learn the rules and you can survive. Ignore the rules and you become a cautionary tale. The academic raised a tentative hand. Professor, what's the most important rule? Excellent question. The most important rule is never assume anything is safe just because it looks safe. In fact, if something looks particularly safe, it's probably the most dangerous thing around. How can something be dangerous because it looks safe? I'm so glad you asked. Gorblax gestured to a nearby flowerbed that had been installed as a visual aid. See those lovely flowers? They're beautiful, aren't they? Peaceful, harmless. The students nodded. They're called serenity blossoms, and they're the most effective predators on the planet. They emit a pheromone that makes you feel calm and safe, encouraging you to come closer and relax. Once you're within range, they inject you with a paralytic that keeps you conscious but immobile while they slowly digest you over the course of several weeks. The students moved away from the flower bed. But here's the thing, Gorblax continued. Once you know they're dangerous, they become almost completely harmless. Their entire strategy depends on you not knowing what they are. Knowledge is the best defense against almost everything on this planet. Over the following weeks, Blix watched as Gorblax transformed from a lonely guardian monster into a genuinely gifted teacher. He had infinite patience with his students, encyclopedic knowledge of the planet's dangers, and a natural talent for explaining complex survival concepts in ways that were both memorable and entertaining. The students, meanwhile, were thriving in ways that none of them had expected. The nervous academic discovered that she had a natural talent for hostile terrain navigation. The military instructor found that his conventional training methods were completely useless on Grimfang Prime, forcing him to develop entirely new approaches to tactical thinking. The bored tourist turned out to have an intuitive understanding of predator psychology that made him surprisingly effective at avoiding the planet's more aggressive wildlife. This is extraordinary, the academic Dr. Philippa Wonderbottom told Blix during one of their weekly progress meetings. I came here expecting to study extreme ecosystems, but I'm learning things about survival and adaptation that I never would have discovered anywhere else. Like what? Like the fact that traditional scientific observation methods don't work when your research subjects are actively trying to eat you. I've had to develop entirely new techniques for studying hostile environments. It's revolutionizing my entire field. The military instructor, Sergeant Boompants McGillicuddy, was equally enthusiastic. My troops are going to love this. Everything I thought I knew about tactical survival was completely wrong. This planet forces you to think in ways that would never occur to you in a normal environment. How so? Well, for example, conventional wisdom says to find high ground for tactical advantage. But on Grimfang Prime, high ground is usually high because something dangerous lives up there. The safest places are often the ones that look dangerous but are actually relatively stable. It's completely counterintuitive. Even the tourist, Fleximander Gigglebottom, was having experiences that exceeded his expectations. I've been to every luxury resort in the galaxy, he told Blix, but nothing has been as thrilling as learning to make tea from plants that are only moderately toxic. The risk-to-reward ratio is incredible. But the real success story was Gorblax himself. I never knew I could be good at anything other than being terrifying. he confided to Blix one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of beautiful toxicity. For centuries, my entire purpose was just existing, being scary, killing people who came to challenge me. I never thought about whether I was actually helping anyone. And now I'm teaching people skills that could save their lives. I'm sharing knowledge that took me centuries to accumulate. I'm actually useful. Gorblax's joy was so intense, it caused several nearby rocks to stop being carnivorous and just sit there feeling happy. Do you know what Dr. Wonderbottom told me today? What? She said that the survival techniques I taught her could be adapted for use on dozens of other hostile worlds. She's planning to publish papers about cooperative environmental hostility management that could help explorers across the galaxy. That's wonderful. And Sergeant McGillicuddy wants to bring his entire unit here for advanced training. He says the problem-solving skills they learn on Grimfang Prime could make them the most effective survival specialists in their military. And Fleximander. Oh, Fleximander is planning to start a whole new form of extreme tourism. He thinks there are thousands of people who would pay enormous amounts of money for the opportunity to safely experience genuinely dangerous environments. As the months passed, word of the Grimfang Prime Educational and Safety Institute spread throughout the galaxy. Applications for admission began pouring in from researchers, military units, adventure seekers, and what Flemington had started calling therapeutic danger enthusiasts. We're going to need to expand, Blix realized as he looked at the growing pile of applications. We can't possibly accommodate all these people with our current facilities. Already on it, Flemington announced, bursting into the office with his usual enthusiasm and an armload of forms. I've filed applications for Phase 2 construction, advanced program development, and faculty expansion. The Department of Remedial Compliance is so impressed with our success rates that they're authorizing unlimited funding for expansion. Unlimited funding? Well, technically it's funding sufficient to meet all reasonable expansion requirements. But given that this is a government project and government definitions of reasonable tend to be quite generous, it's essentially unlimited. What kind of expansion are we talking about? Oh, the works. Additional classroom facilities, advanced laboratory complexes, expanded residential areas, recreation facilities, a proper medical center, and... Flemington paused dramatically. Authorization to recruit additional faculty from across the galaxy. Additional faculty. Think about it. Gorblax is an expert on Grimfang Prime specifically, but what about people who are experts on other hostile environments? We could create the galaxy's first comprehensive survival education program. Students could learn to survive on ice worlds, desert worlds, swamp worlds, volcanic worlds, worlds with hostile gravity, worlds with toxic atmospheres. Blix stared at him. You want to turn this into a university? I want to turn this into the university, the single best place in the galaxy to learn how to survive anywhere. And that's exactly what happened. Over the next 2 years, the Grimfang Prime Educational and Safety Institute expanded into something that even its founders found difficult to believe. New faculty arrived from across the galaxy. Professor Frieselot Chilblain, expert in ice world survival from the frozen reaches. Dr. Sandrina Dustbottom, specialist in desert world navigation from the scorching systems. Master Swamp Thing Murkwater, authority on amphibious environment adaptation from the soggy sectors. Each new faculty member brought their own expertise and their own perspective on the fundamental challenge of surviving in places that actively discouraged survival. The students, meanwhile, could now choose from dozens of specialized programs: advanced hostile environment navigation, interspecies cooperation under extreme stress, creative problem-solving in life or death situations, the psychology of fear management, and Blix's personal favorite, bureaucratic survival techniques for government-related disasters. We've created something incredible here, Dr. Wonderbottom told Blix during the Institute's 2nd anniversary celebration. This isn't just a school anymore, it's a completely new approach to education. Students don't just learn facts here, they learn how to think differently. How so? Traditional education teaches you to find the right answers to known questions, but survival education teaches you to ask the right questions when you don't know what you're dealing with. It's a completely different cognitive process. She was right. The Institute's graduates were becoming known throughout the galaxy for their ability to adapt to unexpected situations, solve complex problems under pressure, and maintain calm effectiveness in circumstances that would panic most people. They were sought after by exploration companies, research institutions, military organizations, and diplomatic services. We're not just teaching survival, Sergeant McGillicuddy observed during a faculty meeting. We're teaching people how to thrive in uncertainty. That's a skill that's valuable everywhere, not just on Deathworlds. But perhaps the most unexpected development was the effect the Institute had on Grimfang Prime itself. The planet, which had spent millennia being thoroughly hostile to all forms of non-native life, began to show signs of what Dr. Wonderbottom diplomatically termed environmental adaptation to sustained sentient presence. Dai, the carnivorous rocks became less aggressively carnivorous and more selectively carnivorous, focusing their hostility on actual threats rather than just anything that moved. The murderous plants developed what appeared to be a primitive recognition system, distinguishing between Institute personnel and students and random victims. It's as if the planet is learning, Dr. Wonderbottom explained during one of her research presentations. The hostile life forms are adapting their behavior based on repeated positive interactions with humans and other sentient species. You mean the planet is becoming nicer? Asked one of the students. Not nicer, exactly. More discriminating. The planet is still perfectly capable of being lethal, but it's becoming more selective about when and how it applies that lethality. This was particularly evident in the areas around the Institute's facilities, which had developed what the faculty had started calling educational hostility zones. The local environment maintained enough danger to provide genuine survival training experiences while avoiding the level of lethality that would actually endanger students. It's like the planet has become a partner in the educational process, Gorblax marveled. It's still teaching the same lessons about survival and respect for dangerous environments, but now it's teaching them in ways that allow students to actually learn from their mistakes, instead of just dying from them. The transformation was so remarkable that it caught the attention of the Galactic Educational Assessment Authority, which sent a team of inspectors to evaluate the Institute's programs and methods. This is unprecedented, declared Chief Inspector Rigmarole Bureaucraticus after completing a comprehensive review. Not only have you created the most effective survival education program in galactic history, but you've somehow managed to domesticate an entire hostile planet without reducing its educational value. Domesticate might be too strong a word, Blix suggested. We prefer to think of it as establishing a mutually beneficial educational partnership. Whatever you call it, it's remarkable. Your graduates are showing success rates in hostile environment situations that are literally off the charts. And your safety record here is better than most safe planets achieve. The inspector's report resulted in the Institute receiving the highest possible accreditation rating and a formal recommendation that its methods be studied and potentially replicated on other challenging worlds throughout the galaxy. We're going to be famous, Flemington announced as he read through the inspector's report. The Department of Educational Excellence wants to use us as a model for innovative institutional cooperation with challenging environmental factors. Does that mean more funding? Gorblax asked hopefully. It means so much more funding that we're going to need to hire accountants just to count it. But for Blix, the real measure of their success wasn't the funding or the recognition or even the remarkable transformation of Grimfang Prime from a death world into an educational paradise. It was the look of accomplishment on the faces of students who had learned not just to survive in impossible conditions, but to thrive in them. "You know what the best part is?" he told Gorblax one evening as they sat in the Institute's observation deck, watching a group of advanced students practice night navigation techniques in a forest that was still technically trying to kill them, but doing so in an educational rather than malicious manner. "What's that? 3 years ago, I was cataloguing rubber ducks in a government office, completely convinced that my life was meaningless. You were sitting alone in a crater, killing people because you thought that was your job. Flemington was processing complaints that nobody ever acted on. And now? Now we're running the most successful educational institution in the galaxy, teaching people skills that could save their lives. And we've somehow managed to turn a planet that was dedicated to destroying everything into a place that's dedicated to teaching everything." Gorblax was quiet for a moment. "Do you think this was all just an accident? The bureaucratic error that sent you here, meeting me, finding Flemington?" Blix considered this. "Maybe. Or maybe the universe has a very strange sense of humor, and this was all part of some cosmic plan we couldn't see at the time. Either way," Gorblax said, "I'm glad it happened." "Me too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their students learn to navigate a world that had once been certain death, but had somehow become the foundation for the most important education of their lives. "You know," Blix said finally, "I used to think that filing the wrong form was the worst mistake I'd ever made. And now I think it might have been the best thing that ever happened to me." As if in response to this observation, a shooting star crossed the sky above Grimfang Prime. Except it wasn't a shooting star. It was another government transport bringing another batch of eager students to learn that the most dangerous places in the universe could also be the most transformative. And somewhere in a government office on a distant space station, a filing clerk was probably right now placing someone's application in the wrong pile, setting in motion another chain of events that would seem like a disaster, but might turn out to be exactly what everyone involved needed most. Because sometimes the universe's biggest mistakes turn out to be its most perfect solutions.